Hello. Today I will tell you, perhaps, about the most important thing in history. He was not just inept. He was dangerous. His decisions cost people's lives. His whims destroyed entire countries. The people's leader about one thing: to end his reign faster. In this issue, we will figure out what he did, why his name still causes horror, and many other things that turn people into a real disaster on the throne. In the early years of the reign of one of many medieval kings, measures were implemented in his kingdom to establish a tax collection system. This system was neither diverse nor particularly complex, but it was characterized by clarity, consistency, and inevitability for all who lived within the state's lands. Decrees issued by the Royal Chancery in specific cases established standards that applied to all taxable households, villages, hamlets, and any other settlements located within his territory. First, inspections were conducted in each settlement to determine the amount of tax to be paid. The purpose of these inspections was not to assess people's living conditions or the quality of the land, but simply to record the existence of a taxable unit. On every plot of land that had at least a few houses or a few cultivated plots, a tax quota was set. Special officials, scribes, were sent to each settlement, tasked with listing all residents, all buildings, all cultivated fields, and all products gathered in those areas. These officials made no distinction between the poor and the wealthy, nor between large and small harvests. Every house, every field, every household was subject to accounting, and at the end of the inspection, a record was made in a special book. This book had no other purpose but to store information for future tax collection. Based on this data, the tax rate for each settlement was determined. This rate remained unchanged for many years and was rarely revised, even in the case of crop failure or disaster. To ensure orderly and consistent tax collection, special institutions, chanceries, were established, where officials kept records of all taxes collected. The records themselves were simple columns of figures, noting the amount of grain collected, the number of livestock handed over to the treasury, or the weight of cloth or raw wool. Each document bore the scribe's signature and the chancery's seal, making it an official record of tax payment. A separate document was created for each settlement, each village, and each community. At the beginning of each year, each settlement received brief, formal orders, dry instructions a few lines long, stating only one thing: the deadline and amount of tax due. The deadline rarely exceeded. To ensure a maximum system stability, multiple copies of the Chancery books were made in certain cases. Each copy was sent to different chanceries, the main chancery in the capital, those in major regional towns, and one within the king's fortress. This duplication was intended to allow record restoration in case of document loss. Each document bore a special seal to confirm its authenticity. For many of the kingdom's inhabitants, this meant an unchanging yearly tax routine. Peasants came in a specific month, on a specific day, to deliver the designated tax. Grain, meat, cloth, cheese, or other products listed in the Chancery Book. This system rarely changed, was rarely reviewed, and seldom made allowances for good or bad harvests. For the Chanceries, it was merely a matter of keeping records, checking dates, and storing goods in cellars and warehouses. Thus, in the early years of this system's establishment, no major upheavals occurred in the kingdom. The layout of villages, farmyards, and storage sites remained the same. For many people, it simply meant the repetition of the same established process year after year. For the Chancery officials, it was routine work, checking records, storing records, comparing records. For the guards, it was routine service, escorting scribes, inspecting tax deliveries, and safeguarding storehouses. Thus, at the beginning of the reign of one of many kings, a clear, simple, and unchanging system of tax collection was established in his kingdom. This system made no distinctions between settlements, individuals, circumstances, or weather conditions. Everyone had to come in a specific month, on a specific day, to deliver a specific amount of tax to a specific warehouse under a specific accounting document. And so began and continued a simple, unchanging, dry, and monotonous system of taxation that did not change in the early years of his reign. In the early years of the king's reign, special locations were designated for storing collected taxes, both within the main fortress and in separate fortified settlements. The organization of these storage facilities was neither varied nor subject to change. Each warehouse had a fixed location, a specific size, and a consistent system of inventory. The main storage was located in the underground part of the royal fortress. This area had a stone floor, thick stone walls, a low ceiling, and several rows of wooden shelves for storing sacks, bundles, baskets, barrels, and chests. To protect the storage areas, heavy oak doors reinforced with iron were installed. Each door had several locks of different types, and the keys were held by Chancery clerks. The keys were not specially marked, except for simple notations in records. Key for door number 1, or key for door number 2. The keys were rarely used. More often, the doors remained locked for months to preserve the established order of storage. When the collected taxes arrived at the fortress warehouse, they were sorted and placed in designated spots. Grain was poured into large oak bins, simple rectangular constructions made of wide planks. Each bin was numbered with black paint on its side. A brief document was attached, noting the date of delivery, type of grain, and approximate weight. Wool bundles were stacked along the stone walls. Cloth was piled in low stacks, tied with rough rope for easier accounting. A short note was attached to the cloth, indicating the year and source of its origin. Meat and cheese were stored in a separate cellar. Its walls were stone-lined with small ventilation holes in the ceiling for airing. Meat was salted in oak barrels, cheese was stored in clay jugs or wrapped in coarse fabric. Each barrel had a short, black number, and the records noted the date of arrival, type of contents, and approximate weight. Cheese was tagged with simple wooden labels tied with string bearing a short inscription: month, type of cheese, weight. In the main chancery, Several books were kept to account for the goods. These were simple books: leather bindings, rough paper pages, ink entries. Each incoming item was recorded with a short line: date, type of goods, weight or quantity, storage number. Expenditures were noted in a separate book, though they were rare, as the collected goods usually remained in storage for many years. A special guard force was assigned to protect the storage areas. Several men stood watch at each entrance. The doors were locked at the beginning of the year and rarely opened until the next year. Clerks came for inspections once a month or every few months. To maintain the appearance of complete accounting, partial inspections were sometimes carried out. Clerks, guards, and several workers checked one bin or row of goods, comparing physical stock with the record book. If the contents matched the records, the inspection was concluded and the facility was locked until the following year. For convenient storage, goods were sorted not only by type, but also by the year of arrival. Grain bins were marked with the year and grain variety. Wool bundles had leather tags with the burned-in year. Fabric bundles were logged in the chancery books with the month and year. This system was rarely revised or rechecked. Each record corresponded to a product category, and each category was rarely reviewed, only in cases of suspected accounting violations. Barrels were stored on simple stone stands. Each had a short number recorded in the master ledger. Cheese, wrapped in cloth, was placed in wicker baskets, each basket numbered in black paint. The same was done for meat. Each barrel was given a short number with a matching entry in the record book. To preserve the stored goods, cellars were kept at a controlled temperature. Warm air was prevented from entering. Doors remained closed throughout the year, except for inspections or accounting. Grain was poured into bins at the start of the year. Meat was salted in the first months, and cheese was stored in the first weeks after arrival. Once placed in the cellar, products were rarely removed. No complex methods were used to check the goods. A simple inspection of one bin or one row was considered enough to verify the state of the entire batch. A short note was written: "Quantity preserved, no damage." These entries were then recorded in the main ledger. In other parts of the kingdom, small storage facilities were built using the same model as the main fortress. Each had a stone cellar for storing grain, wool, fabric, meat, cheese, and honey. Each facility had a short list of received taxes, a brief ledger, and a short entry in the Royal Chancery's main book. Each was inspected several times a year to confirm the safety of the stored goods. Protection measures were simple. Iron bars were placed on the doors, books were checked, and seals or tags were verified. Guards were stationed at the entrances to prevent unauthorized access. Clerks from the main chancery conducted brief inspections, made short notes in their books, and locked the facilities again. This process repeated year after year. Each warehouse entry in the books included the month, type of goods, quantity or weight, and the storage number. An additional note marked the date of inspection or storage. Each entry had a number for easier tracking. Once the system of tax collection and storage had been brought to a stable, repetitive, and unchanging form, the next stage of governance in the kingdom became the systematic tightening of control over the accumulated resources. The goal of this process was not to simplify access to the stored goods or to facilitate their handling. The goal was singular: to eliminate any possibility of unauthorized access, to make unpermitted entry impossible, and to ensure complete immobility of the resources already gathered in the Treasury. This led to a series of architectural, organizational, and procedural changes both within the fortress and beyond. The first step in this direction was the increase in the number of guards. All warehouses within the main fortress were placed under round-the-clock watch. Duty rosters were drawn up monthly, and each guard knew their shift and station. Guards were forbidden to leave their post without a replacement, even in cases of bad weather, illness, or other circumstances. Each shift had to be recorded in the guard duty ledger. This ledger was kept in the small chancery located in the western tower of the fortress. It listed the names of the guards, their duty hours, the date, and a mark confirming their shift. If a shift was not recorded, an inspection was required. In addition to guards stationed at the warehouses, internal patrols were introduced. Their task was to inspect the locks, check the integrity of doors, walls, and floors, and ensure the storage areas were properly sealed. These patrols consisted of 2 men accompanied by a scribe. The scribe made brief notes on everything observed. He had no authority to issue orders, only to document the condition of the premises in a special ledger. Inspections were unannounced. The records were never edited or deleted. They were stored in an archive accessible only to 2 senior clerks. To strengthen physical protection, the doors to the cellars were further reinforced. The wood was replaced every 2 years. All planks were treated with lime, resin, and oil to prevent rot. Hinges were replaced every 4 years. Each lock had a duplicate key stored separately, in another tower, in another room, under the guard of a different watch unit. This meant that access to a single room, the tightening of control was accompanied by a ban on verbal communication between guards and scribes. Communication was permitted only via written tablets with pre-approved phrases: open, close, inspection, access granted, access denied, wait. Each tablet use was recorded, its number logged in a journal, and the journal filed in the archive. The tablets were kept in a special room. No more than 20 existed. No new ones were made to prevent creative or unregulated exchanges. In addition, the entrance procedure to the fortress became stricter. Each worker had to present a wooden token with their clearance number. Tokens were made once a year in a triangular shape with a notch. If a token was chipped, cracked, or worn, it was confiscated and the bearer was suspended from work until the issue was resolved. Tokens were checked during morning roll call and returned in the evening. No one was allowed to remain inside the storage area overnight. Everyone had to leave by sunset. This rule was recorded in the evening inspection ledger. As part of protecting the accumulated resources, a final measure was introduced: triple sealing of rooms. The first seal, wax, was placed on the lock. The second, lead, was tied to a string at the door. The third, ink on paper, was affixed to the wall nearby. Each seal had its own number, shape, and color. Every opening required the removal of all 3 seals, and each replacement was logged. The seal numbers were cross-checked. A mismatch in even one was considered a violation, and the room was resealed pending investigation. Each of these actions was routine, repetitive, and performed unchanged for many years. Staff changed, books were replaced, doors were renewed, but the procedure remained the same. It was repeated every day, every month, every year. Orders were never revised. Scribes continued to write the same lines, guards stood in the same positions, tokens were checked at the same hours, seals were replaced with the same frequency. Thus, the tightening of control in the kingdom did not lead to development, improvement, or restructuring of life. It only reinforced the stability, monotony, and continuity of tax accumulation, storage, and detachment. For decades, the order remained unbroken. No one questioned the necessity of storage. No one proposed redistribution. No one suggested simplifying or accelerating the process. Everything was stored. Everything was inspected. Everything was recorded. Everything remained in its place. Over time, as the royal storehouses continued to fill with new supplies of grain, wool, meat, cheese, honey, and other goods, small but steadily growing changes began to take place in the daily lives of the peasantry. Each new year brought fresh decrees that increased the portion of produce to be taken in favor of the crown. This was reflected in the gradual routine rise in taxes paid by peasants living in villages, hamlets, and homesteads under the king's rule. The collection of dues took place at a set time of year, usually in the autumn after the harvest. Tax collectors would arrive in the villages, bringing with them scribes assembled according to strict chancellery regulations. They would first erect simple canopies in the center of the village, place crude wooden tables underneath, lay out their account books, brushes for writing, and clay jars filled with ink. Around the tables, they would arrange empty baskets for collecting eggs, containers for honey, wooden boxes for cheese, and plain sacks for grain. The collection was carried out without ceremony. Peasants took turns bringing their yield. First came those who had more land, then those with smaller plots. Each person brought a certain quantity of goods established in advance. The collectors checked against their records, made brief marks: quantity submitted, balance remaining, time of receipt. Sacks of grain were checked by hand. Eggs were laid out one by one on simple wooden trays. Cheese was removed from baskets for inspection. All of this was done silently or with monotonous remarks. Peasants waited their turn, eyes downcast, awaiting the end of the process. Every new year, the tax rate increased. Where once the peasants surrendered a tenth of their harvest, later it became a fifth, and now a third. Eventually, this left barely enough food for their own consumption. Diets changed. Instead of more expensive products, they kept the cheaper ones. Instead of meat, more porridge. Instead of milk, more water. This happened gradually, year by year, without any visible outbursts of discontent. Everything was accepted silently. The way of life also changed. Peasants increasingly refrained from setting aside grain for future planting or drying grasses for livestock feed. Livestock numbers dwindled, as some were taken during collections to restock the royal stores. Meadows became overgrown, pastures stood empty, and plots of land went untended due to lack of labor. During the winter, when supplies were low, peasants adhered to a strict diet. Once a day, they prepared a simple gruel with water, a small amount of grain, and tiny pieces of vegetables. Children were taught to preserve everything in the household. Parents trained them to reuse items repeatedly. Clothes were mended until the fabric turned to rags. Shoes were patched with leather scraps. Firewood was saved. Homes were only heated during the coldest days. The rest of the time, the homes remained cold. Frost clung to the walls. People slept together on hay, wrapped in coarse blankets. The collector's arrival in the village always followed the same procedures. First, they set up their canopies and laid out their books. Then, they briefly announced the required amount. Peasants silently laid out their baskets. The collectors took each basket, checked it against the records, made brief notes. Once the collection was complete, everything was loaded onto carts. The carts were hitched to horses brought by the collectors. They departed. The next day, it all repeated in another village. After the collectors left, the peasants returned to their homes, silently estimating how much food remained until the next collection. They didn't speak of it loudly. Conversations were brief. Words were saved. Year after year, the same cycle repeated, without visible change. Fields were sown by hand. The ears were cut with sickles. The sheaves were stacked in ricks, which were covered with straw. On the threshing floors, grain was threshed with flails. The leftover straw was used as bedding for livestock. The grain was winnowed, poured into sacks. The collectors always arrived after all this had been done. Over time, the homes deteriorated more and more. Repairs were done less frequently to save strength for the harvest. Roofs were thatched with straw, which rotted quickly. Floors sagged in places. Doors creaked. Windows were covered with ox bladders or thin planks. All of this became a familiar sight. By day, peasants worked the fields or tended to livestock. In the evening, they cooked food, if there was any. At night, they slept wrapped in coarse fabrics. In the morning, everything began again. The growing tax burden gradually led to a loss in population. Some left for neighboring regions, hoping to find lands with lower taxes. Some went to the city seeking work. Some left their homes abandoned. The number of cultivated fields decreased. Yet the collectors still came, demanding even more from those who remained to make up for the shortages elsewhere. With repeated collections, more often peasants had to surrender their last reserves of grain meant for their own needs. This weakened families. People grew thinner, more exhausted. Illnesses spread more easily. Peasants used simple herbs for treatment. There were no doctors. Mortality increased gradually, without surges. The collectors did not alter their actions. They continued to arrive with books. The gradual tightening of the tax system and its consistent, regular, and predictable enforcement began to affect the population of the kingdom. This didn't happen all at once, but slowly, steadily, and in a recurring pattern, without any visible sharp changes. The number of people in the villages declined, and their way of life shifted more and more toward conserving energy, food, and time. At first, this was reflected in the growing tendency among young people to delay marriage. The land left to families after taxes were collected was no longer enough to support multiple generations. Young men, who once sought to start their own households, now remained in their parents' homes. Young women delayed marriage, waiting until the bare minimum resources for a future family had been gathered. Over time, the number of new families decreased. Delayed marriages led to fewer children being born. Families that still decided to have a child often limited themselves to one or two. Childbirth occurred with minimal assistance. Midwives asked for less payment, content with whatever they were offered, sometimes just a few eggs or a scrap of cloth. Meanwhile, mortality remained steady or even increased. In winter, living conditions worsened. Homes were not heated well enough. Food ran low, and colds turned into lingering illnesses. Diseases spread unchecked, and peasants treated themselves with familiar home remedies, herbal infusions, leaf compresses, poultices of honey or vinegar. Gradually, the villages lost those too weak to survive the winter. The number of elderly shrank year by year. This eroded the experienced part of the population, the very people who preserved knowledge about farming, food storage, and tool repair. Their absence led to a slow loss of skills, or their preservation only in fragments. The number of able-bodied men declined, not only due to illness, but also because many left for the cities in search of work, or moved to other lands. They left quietly, without hope of return, taking only a small sack with a few flatbreads, a piece of cloth, and a cheap knife. Few came back. Urban trades and hard day labor were scarcely better, but at least allowed them to send a little money home. Demographic changes unfolded so gradually that it was hard to identify a turning point. In the Chancery books, which recorded grain yields, household counts, and population numbers in each village, the changes appeared as steadily declining figures. There were no village schools, and literacy was almost non-existent. Children helped their parents from an early age, herding goats, gathering firewood, carrying water, sorting grain. As a result, every child's life mirrored that of the previous generation, but with even fewer resources. In villages near roads, peasants began to notice more and more grain carts passing by, while their own fields diminished. This reflected a shifting population pattern and suggested an indirect redistribution. Some abandoned their homes, leaving them empty. Moss grew on the roofs, walls became moldy, doors sagged on rusty hinges. Village cemeteries expanded, though no one paid it much mind. Graves appeared near churches or small chapels. Most were unmarked. Wooden crosses or stone slabs were rare, made only for those with the means, or with someone left to make them. Over time, the age structure changed. There were fewer young people, and proportionally, more elderly, until they too died, with no one to replace them. The demographic pyramid narrowed at the base. The number of people able to work the land decreased. This lowered total harvests, further reducing what was left after taxes. Some villages slowly fell into decline. Others merged. A few remaining families would band together to work a single shared field, living under one roof. Houses were rarely rebuilt. People used what was already there. Roofs were patched with bits of straw, windows boarded up. Everything was done only when absolutely necessary. Where population growth had once been slow but steady, that process now reversed. Tax registries were no longer filled with new names, but increasingly bore notes like abandoned or inhabited no longer. This became routine, barely drawing notice. In some areas, the gender balance shifted. As men more often left for work or died of illness, women became the majority. Some of them took on traditionally male tasks: plowing, mending fences, collecting firewood. This wore them down physically and affected their health. The books reflected it with cold precision. Just numbers. Older peasants remembered times when, after taxes, there was still a small stash of food for winter. Now it was different. The collectors were stricter, the lists longer, the questions shorter, and the leftovers fewer. No one spoke of it aloud. No one complained in front of outsiders. No one expressed discontent. Everything was accepted as it was. The number of children shrank with each generation. In some villages, children's voices were rarely heard. More days passed in silence. Only footsteps, the rustle of wind in straw roofs, the crackling of hearths, if there was firewood left. The demographic situation meant there was no one left to clear new. As the population of the kingdom gradually declined, this phenomenon began to affect both the structure of crafts and the volume and methods of trade. Crafts, which once played a significant role in the economies of villages and towns, gradually lost their importance, while trade adapted to the new conditions, remaining limited and governed by strict rules set by the royal authority. Craft workshops, located mainly in cities and large villages, began to face difficulties due to a lack of available labor. The shrinking population meant fewer hands to work. Young people who might have learned a craft increasingly either stayed in agriculture or left their native places in search of better prospects, often heading to less populated but more promising regions, or to the cities. As a result, the training of new professionals slowed down and the number of skilled craftsmen dwindled. The reduction in the craft workforce led to a decline in production volumes. Workshops operated at nearly minimal capacity. Only the most essential goods were produced: tools, clothing, footwear. Luxury items, or products intended for trade with other regions, were made less and less frequently. Consumption became focused on basic needs. Outdated tools and equipment were rarely replaced. Repairing or replacing broken parts was difficult due to a lack of materials and qualified specialists. Blacksmiths, for example, increasingly focused only on repairing agricultural tools and basic household items like knives and buckles. Tanners and tailors worked with a limited range of materials. Natural fabrics and leathers, which used to be supplied via trade routes, now arrived in smaller quantities. This was due both to decreased demand and to transportation restrictions imposed by the royal government to maintain control over resources. Trade in the kingdom also underwent changes. Markets that once attracted merchants from various lands were held less frequently. Trade routes became shorter and more heavily regulated, patrolled by guards and customs officials tasked with preventing smuggling and the unlawful removal of tax goods. Each transaction was meticulously recorded in accounting books. Sellers and buyers were required to report every operation to the local authorities. Trading without official permission was prohibited. As a result, trade volumes were strictly limited and did not exceed what was deemed necessary. Goods were exchanged primarily within local communities. Trade between villages became rare and took place only over short distances, mostly in the form of barter. grain for wool, honey for eggs, cheese for vegetables. Long-distance caravans became rare as they required significant resources and posed the decline in the number of craftsmen, and the reduction in trade activity slowed down the overall economic momentum. Fewer goods were produced, fewer products were exchanged, which led to stagnation in prosperity and development, limited to only those sectors essential for survival. Nevertheless, despite the decrease in volume, crafts and trade retained some importance. They ensured a minimally sustainable standard of living and facilitated the redistribution of resources within the kingdom. The work of artisans and the activity of merchants, though diminished, remained essential components of the system that upheld the tax structure and royal control. Control over crafts and trade was exercised through a rigid bureaucratic system. Each craftsman was required to obtain a license, which was reviewed annually. Merchants were subject to inspections at customs checkpoints. All transactions were registered in the chancery. Violations were punished with fines, confiscation of goods, or even revocation of the right to practice a craft or engage in trade. Thus, despite demographic and economic challenges, the system maintained stability through the strict enforcement of rules and the routinization of procedures. Crafts and trade gradually declined, but did not disappear, continuing to function in an environment where control and record-keeping took precedence over development and initiative. As the population declined and the tax burden on peasants and urban craftsmen gradually increased, the lifestyle of the nobility outwardly remained unchanged. However, upon closer examination, slow and almost imperceptible changes were occurring within it. The nobles, who held land, possessed the right to collect taxes and exercised control over various parts of the kingdom, maintained their customs and the order of daily life, established over generations. Each day for the nobility began with the same ceremonial routine. In the rooms where the lords of the estates slept, there was always a designated person tasked with waking them at the same time, at the first light of dawn, or, if circumstances allowed, slightly later to preserve the habitual rhythm of life. Upon waking, the nobleman dressed with the assistance of a servant, who carefully and unhurriedly presented the garments in a strict order: shirt, overcoat, belt, and cloak if needed. Breakfast consisted of a familiar set of foods: bread, cheese, a piece of meat, or some eggs, all brought silently from the kitchen by servants. The quantity of food served remained the same, even though resupplying it became increasingly difficult, as peasants delivered less each year. Yet for the nobles this went unnoticed. There was always enough to meet their needs. After breakfast came the discussion of current affairs. If the noble had a steward, he would ask the usual questions. How much grain had been gathered in the past week? How much had been brought to the granaries? What news came from the fields? The steward, relying on the accounting books, responded in a rehearsed manner, quoting figures that changed slowly, without sharp fluctuations. Everything was recorded on separate sheets and stored in cabinets, rarely reviewed until an inspection was due. During the day, the nobility followed a familiar routine: receiving letters, signing documents, issuing orders, which were then delivered by messengers throughout the region. These orders concerned the same matters as always: tax collection, guarding storage facilities, repairing bridges or roads, restricting movement. All was carried out with no changes to procedures long established over the years. Noble meals at midday were conducted without celebration. The table was set according to strict etiquette, dishes placed symmetrically, courses served in a predetermined order, and wine poured in equal amounts for each person. Nobles ate in silence, exchanging only short, neutral phrases. Conversations were limited to the weather, field conditions, the volume of delivered produce, and the state of the dams. Topics remained the same, repeating day after day. The rooms in which the nobility lived were kept in unchanging order. Tapestries with traditional motifs, hunting scenes, symbols of power, family crests lined the walls. Every day, servants dusted carved cabinets, velvet-upholstered chairs, and small shelves with nameless books. As the demographic situation in the kingdom changed more noticeably and the burden on the lower estates remained unchanged, the relationships between various social groups gradually shifted toward greater distance, though this transformation remained concealed beneath the shell of familiar rituals. Peasants, urban craftsmen, nobles, and royal officials continued to interact within long-established norms that were followed without deviation. However, the internal substance of these relations gradually lost the visible mutual concern that had once lent them the appearance of balanced order. Peasants increasingly stopped seeing tax collectors as representatives of authority who were even formally inclined to consider their circumstances. The collectors came, checked the records, took their share of produce and left. The peasants complied without protest, silently laying out what they could give. Conversations were limited to brief remarks, which grew fewer with each season. Politeness was maintained out of tradition, not out of personal sympathy or trust. Craftsmen, who had once interacted with peasants through trade, took less and less interest in their affairs, content with whatever goods were brought to them. The peasants, in turn, could increasingly rarely afford to buy anything, so their interactions with artisans were limited to rare transactions for repairing a spade, making new boots, or purchasing salt. Traders bought from those who had anything to sell. The rest were ignored. The nobility maintained their privileges within the same ritualistic framework, distancing themselves ever further from the lower classes. Peasants and craftsmen saw nobles only at official gatherings, during the issuance of decrees, or during rare inspections of villages. Any interaction with the upper class followed a pre-scripted routine: bows, brief answers to questions, swift checks. After such encounters, nobles would promptly withdraw to their homes without lingering among the common folk. Under these conditions, mutual understanding between the estates disappeared. All contact was reduced to formal interactions repeated in unchanging form. Royal officials, who oversaw tax collection, property records, land demarcations, and other matters, engaged with the lower classes in an increasingly detached manner. Their task was to carry out orders, record figures, and deliver reports to the chancery. People became mere entries in ledgers. This contributed further to the cooling of relationships. The peasants knew the officials would return next season to perform the same procedures. The officials, in turn, knew the peasants would submit without resistance. These same changes affected relationships among the peasants themselves. As the population shrank, neighbors were less often able to help one another with farming or house repairs. Everyone focused on their own survival, trying to retain. As the kingdom settled ever more firmly into its established way of life, with its unchanging system of tax collection, crafts, trade, and other familiar routines, the ongoing demographic decline began to make an increasingly visible impact on the surrounding landscape. At first slow and barely perceptible, this transformation became unmistakable with time. It could be seen in the untended fields, in the forests that steadily expanded their domain, in the river valleys that gradually returned to a wild and natural equilibrium. Fields that for centuries had been cultivated with care for grain production were now tilled with far less diligence than before, when such work had been an integral part of rural life. Fewer and fewer hands emerged at dawn to plow the soil, pull the weeds, or gather the ripe ears of grain. As the population shrank, farming grew increasingly selective. Only plots closest to villages were worked, while more distant lands were gradually abandoned. These quickly became overgrown with grasses that no one came to cut, and within a few seasons, shrubs began to appear. Heather, wild rose, blackthorn. Once clearly marked fields now took on the look of neglect and wilderness. Paths that once crisscrossed these lands now faded into the overgrowth. Peasants with carts and herders once traveled them frequently, as did wagons laden with goods for village trade. Now the ruts filled with grass, and in places turned into narrow trails barely distinguishable from a meadow. Meadows once mowed for hay were left untouched, where wild grasses bloomed in abundance: buttercup, clover, plantain. They grew unchecked, forming thick mats difficult to walk through without becoming entangled in the stalks. The forests that had long surrounded the villages changed even more noticeably. With fewer woodcutters, more trees reached full maturity, while the spaces between trunks filled densely with underbrush. Ferns, mosses, shrubs, and young shoots of oak and pine covered every gap. Sunlight barely reached the forest floor through the dense canopy. Birds nested closer to the paths, now rarely used, and wild animals no longer shied away from humans they hardly encountered. The woods were increasingly filled with fallen trees, lying untouched for years and slowly rotting. Peasants no longer came for dry branches once gathered for firewood. Twigs became coated in moss and fungi. The ground beneath them grew soft and damp. The forest began to resemble something ancient and untouched, as though human hands had withdrawn entirely from its quiet and tangled life. The road network, once vital for connecting villages, lost its clarity. Roads were no longer maintained, although they had once been repaired annually through collected levies and labor. Alongside the changes in forests and fields, the state of gardens also shifted. Those once maintained near the homes of nobles, monks, or well-off peasants. As the population declined, so too did the care for fruit trees and bushes. Pruning became infrequent, and the soil around the trees grew thick with weeds. The gardens gradually grew wild, losing their orderly geometry. Dry branches broke under their own weight. Fruit was left hanging on the trees or fell to the ground to be eaten by small animals and birds. What once had been carefully planted orchards of apple, plum, and pear trees now exuded the quiet stillness of untamed nature. The familiar relationship between people and water also began to erode. Wells were more often left uncleared. Their walls grew slick with moss and mold, and the water inside turned stagnant. In spring-fed areas, fallen leaves accumulated, and the cool water began to seep into the earth, vanishing among the roots. Small streams sometimes shifted their courses, undermining their banks and carrying away the remains of footbridges and walkways. These changes made once passable routes through the land increasingly difficult. Where people had once walked easily with their burdens, they were now stopped by thickets of riverside grass or patches of marshy ground. Wild animals, once wary of human settlements, now more frequently appeared at the edges of villages. Foxes, badgers, and hares no longer feared being disturbed. Hunters, who used to organize drives, were now rarely seen in these parts. Larger animals, like deer, roamed more freely across open lands, leaving tracks through the overgrown meadows. Birds, once accustomed to nesting in forests, now built their homes in the shrubbery that had sprung up near houses left empty or nearly deserted. Soil itself began to change. Lands that were no longer plowed lost their soft, loose structure. Rain compressed them, and grasses formed a dense sod over top. Water pooled in low-lying areas, and each year these spots turned more and more into small, boggy clearings. They were no longer used for farming or drained, although in earlier times peasants had worked to make them suitable for hay or pasture. Abandoned plots between villages became increasingly choked with dense vegetation, in places forming continuous thickets. This led to the disappearance of familiar landmarks: lone oaks at the field's edge, wells by old roads, or stone markers carved with way signs. Now these were hidden under foliage, moss, and tangled branches. A person walking through such places could easily lose their way, as everything looked the same, an unbroken, empty landscape with no clear boundaries. The outskirts of villages lost their former contours. Garden plots were overtaken by nettles, burdock, and thistles that no one cut back. The land gradually lost the qualities that human cultivation had once given it: looseness, even moisture, freedom from weeds.
The surrounding space bore ever stronger traces of this gradual transformation. Utility buildings that had once stored grain, hay, or tools slowly fell into decay. The roofs of sheds sagged in places. The thatch or wooden shingles darkened and crumbled under the weight of rain. The walls became mottled with moss and mildew, spreading ever wider. Hinges rusted and creaked at the slightest touch. But it was rare for anyone to open those doors anymore. All of this gave abandoned places an air of neglect and forgetfulness, in which nature was increasingly taking charge. Fields no longer used for planting began to blend with meadows, growing quieter year-round, disturbed only by wind, the rustle of grasses, and the distant cries of birds. Even for gathering berries or herbs, peasants passed through less and less. Boundaries once marked by fences now faded, stakes rotted and fell, wattle fences collapsed and became overgrown. As a result, the former order of land ownership dissolved, merging into a seamless, uniform green expanse. Abandoned croplands were first overtaken by grasses, then by young trees, birches, alders, willows. Their roots broke through the sod, their branches intertwined, gradually casting shade over the ground. The moist soil welcomed moss and ferns. Birds nested in the lower branches. Small animals forged their paths under shrubs, as though humans had walked here only in some distant past. It all gave the land the look of a wild forest, though not long ago these plots had been held by deed or passed down through inheritance. Traces of human presence remained, yet were steadily consumed by the green tide of nature. Crosses on old graves, once maintained and repainted, now leaned askew and were draped in moss. Wooden markers decayed faster than stone. Their shapes and inscriptions faded, as though time itself was erasing the memory of those who had once lived here. Churchyards that had once seen visitors during holidays or burials turned into overgrown patches, distinguishable from the woods only by occasional openings between trees. Alongside these changes, the sounds of human life faded. The chopping of axes, the whinnying of horses, the murmur of voices were heard less and less. In their place, the wind grew louder, as did the patter of rain, the caws of crows and magpies, the whisper of branches in sudden gusts. Sunlight reached the ground less often beneath the spreading canopy, so even in summer the earth remained cool, carpeted with moss, humus, and fallen leaves. The roads between villages gradually narrowed, their edges swallowed by nettles, thistles, and brambles. Rain washed out the ruts that once were leveled by wagon wheels. Stones once used to reinforce the paths sank into the mud, hidden beneath moss and grass.
As the surrounding environment continued to change under the slow decline of the population, the settlements themselves carried on in the same rhythm established decades before. The houses retained their familiar appearance: low-pitched roofs, whitewashed walls with dark wooden beams, small windows with woven shutters. The few villagers who remained lived the same kind of life their ancestors had known. Each morning brought the same routine. Women cooked or mended clothing, men repaired fences, cleared out scraps, checked stores of tools, now seldom used. All this unfolded without haste, in a repetitive and unhurried manner. The dwindling number of residents affected what kinds of work could still be done. Large undertakings, like building new sheds or repairing dams, were attempted less and less, as they required several strong hands no longer available. Instead, people contented themselves with smaller tasks, patching a hole in the roof, propping up a sagging fence, refilling a straw mattress. Every activity was carried out slowly, with long pauses in between. The urge to change anything grew weaker. The village streets lay empty for most of the day. Children who once ran along the paths had become a rare sight, and those who remained were more often helping their parents with chores than playing games. Piles of branches that had fallen the previous autumn still lay where they had landed. No one cleared them away, waiting instead for them to rot and crumble on their own. Weeds lined the roadsides, uncut and unchecked, though not long ago villagers would have gathered them for livestock. Inside the homes the same hush prevailed. The stove was kindled only as needed. Food was rationed with care, though the reduced number of mouths meant supplies lasted longer. Families ate the same simple meals: bread, porridge, and, on occasion, some salted fish or meat. Meals were prepared slowly, unhurriedly, as though time itself had stretched, its boundaries between morning, midday, and evening blurring into one long flow. Communal buildings, the storage barns, the small forge, the shared granary, gradually fell into disuse. Their doors were opened less and less. Roofs caved in here and there, supports rotted, and rusted hinges groaned in the wind. Dust settled thick on the door frames, undisturbed. In the corners, dry crumbs of wood and straw piled up. Still, these spaces kept their form. Everything stood in its place, even if rarely touched anymore. The village square, once the place for gatherings and celebrations, now stood silent. The well at its center still held water, though the daily lives of the villagers remained unchanged, and yet grew increasingly sparse. In the morning, just as the dampness of night gave way to pale daylight, a few people would step slowly out of their homes, carrying the same tools their parents had once used. Their tasks changed little. One fastened a latch to a shed door, another trimmed branches from an old gooseberry bush, a third carried a bucket of water from the well. All of it was done without hurry, without conversation. Only the occasional brief remark drifted away on the wind. The mills at the edge of the village stood silent more often than not. Their wheels now bore a rusty sheen, and the water channels were choked with sedge. Though the millers still lived by their mills, their labor was rarely needed. Little grain was brought, and what was ground was used sparingly. The millstones gathered a fine dust, settling in the stillness between gusts of wind. Yet the mills remained a part of the village landscape, even as all movement around them faded. Over the years, the paths between houses narrowed. Bushes of lilac, elder, and wild rose crept closer to the fences. Villagers seldom pruned them, seeing no pressing need. As a result, narrow passages formed between the yards, some overgrown with grass. A few footpaths now led to dead ends, lost under burdock and thistle, though once they had connected to kitchen gardens or small storage sheds. The sounds of domestic labor grew muted. The creak of cartwheels, the tap of a hammer, the bang of a door, all of it echoed faintly in the empty hush of the village, fading into the thick air. The wind carried the scent of damp earth, rotting leaves, and the occasional whiff of smoke from a distant hearth. The whole landscape took on a calm sameness, as if time itself had slowed, settled, obeying the steady rhythm of routine life. Old buildings continued to decay gradually. In some places, roof tiles fell away. In others, chunks of clay plaster collapsed, revealing the woven frame beneath. And though people noticed these signs of wear, they seldom repaired them. There was neither much reason nor surplus strength. Any maintenance was done only when absolutely necessary, when the roof leaked too badly, or when a door could no longer be closed at all. The household items, accumulated over generations, cast iron pots, ceramic bowls, willow baskets, were now used less and less. Some sat gathering dust on shelves, others rusted or cracked from neglect. Autumn arrived gently, with long gray days and early twilight. During this time, villagers were especially wary of the wind, which began to tear at dry leaves and snap brittle branches. They carefully tidied their yards, swept the paths, and stored the last of the harvest in their cellars. All done at a calm, unhurried pace, as though preparing for a long period of stillness. Many people now seldom left the boundaries of the village, venturing out only for the most necessary tasks, visiting the market in a neighboring settlement, delivering firewood to the hearth, checking the condition of the fences. The roads held no rush, only the occasional sound of footsteps and the quiet murmuring of a stream. The air carried the scent of damp soil, wet leaves, and the faint bitterness of hearth smoke. Inside the homes, silence reigned, broken only by the sound of doors closing, the crackling of firewood in the stove, and soft conversations. Families gathered by the hearth to warm themselves and spend time together. Their talks were quiet and repetitive, accounts of the day just past, simple plans for the next, and memories of times long gone. These conversations maintained a fragile sense of connection, helping them endure the cold and unwelcoming months. The state of the roads worsened with each passing year. Prolonged rains softened the paths, turning them into muddy flows. Stone bridges over the streams increasingly needed repair, but lacking enough workers and materials, their condition declined steadily. In some places, the bridges became impassable, forcing villagers to seek out roundabout paths that often led through swamps and thick underbrush. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of the settlements, nature steadily reclaimed more and more ground. Abandoned plots grew over with dense grass and brush. Trees pushed through the remnants of fences and hedgerows, and wild animals ventured ever closer to the homes. Foxes, hares, and birds no longer feared humans, moving freely through the empty streets and yards. Under such conditions, village life seemed frozen in time, unhurried, monotonous, with little hope of change. With each day, more houses stood empty, and those who remained spoke more and more often of how difficult it had become to preserve even a semblance of vitality or purpose.